you're all very welcome. And this is actually, I think, a fascinating session because we're going to bring together digital and net zero carbon together. So I'm really chuffed to be joined by a very high quality panel with me. Hopefully they're online as well. And I'd be delighted to bring them into the room with me. Great, Helen, and Chris and Aidan. So we have about an hour and 10 minutes, I think, to be with you. We have lots to cover in the period. What I was going to do was actually ask each of my fellow panelists to introduce themselves, and then I'll go forward. But to actually make it more difficult, or to make it slightly more intriguing or difficult for them, I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves, but also come up with a bit of provocation about where they think this is a really tricky thing. There's lots of areas in this that we all get irked by or frustrated by on a regular basis. So to make this real and to actually share very important things with you, Helen, would you mind starting? Briefly introduce yourself and what you do, but then also could you actually introduce your provocation as well?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Helen Hoff. I work for Bryden Wood and I'm head of sustainability there. So for those of you who don't know, Bryden Wood are designers, mostly made up of architects and engineers. So on a day-to-day basis, I work with both the architectural and engineering teams working towards net zero carbon buildings. So that's looking at the whole life cycle of the building, so the operational energy, trying to reduce that, and also the embodied carbon as well. But we also try and balance that with occupant comfort and well-being. So my background is in both engineering and architecture, which is quite interesting, and it gives me quite an interesting job and viewpoint now, I guess. So provocation, what I've been thinking quite a lot about recently is how we can reuse buildings. So that is obviously critical to achieving net zero carbon. But quite often we find that buildings are demolished. Now that's either because they're at the end of their life, and that's possibly quite a justified thing to do, or actually we're not finding out enough about that existing building through poor fact finding mostly, but also because information isn't available. So what can we do now to make sure that doesn't happen in the future to the buildings that we're building today? And I think it's all down to sort of digital design and collating information. We need to make sure that we're designing buildings that can be adapted easily, simplistically, to suit either changing uses, changing work patterns, different climates, that kind of thing. And that comes down to making sure the information is really easily readable for future teams. But also we need to build in that adaptability and flexibility, but without over-designing. So we need to be really clear about the design conditions that we're using, the material choices, things like material passports. But anything we can do to extend the life of the building, that's a really good thing. But how do we make sure that we're not using additional materials now that may never become beneficial in the future? It's a question that I don't think has got a very, very clear answer.
Thanks, Helen. I totally agree. I think it brings in the whole aspect of sort of circularity and how we sort of minimize use of virgin resources from mining and everything else. And we look at the volumes of concrete that have been produced and we use every day. And actually, you then look around the whole world and you sort of say, well, China has now industrialized and have sort of raised their carbon emissions hugely on the planet. If India and Africa and South America industrialize in the same way, on the same Western trajectory, then basically it's game over on climate change. So I think it's a really neat macrocosm of sort of the overall problem of where we're at. Chris, you're next up. So if you could do the same, give a quick introduction to yourself and actually why you're here in a way, and then give us your provocation.
Thanks, Tim. Hi, everyone. My name's Chris Mortensen. I'm one of the co-founders of Modulus and Chief Product Officer. For those that don't know Modulus, we're a construction technology company. We were founded about 4 years ago, and our vision is really to empower society to help solve the housing crisis while protecting the planet for future generations. And we do that through a combination of technologies, both physical and digital. So we've got a digital software that marries along with a physical offsite product that helps us move towards that sustainable, healthy, affordable housing product globally. Now, when we were thinking about provocations, really it comes back to like our ability to hit that 1.5 or maybe not hit that 1.5 that we all agreed was that upper limit at Paris Agreement back in 2015. And back in 2015, the 5-year look ahead was there was a 0% chance of that happening in the next 5 years. And then fast forward to 2020, and that became a 20% chance. And then just this year, the Met said there's a 50-50 chance now that we're going to breach 1.5 in the next 5 years. And when we look at the ambitions that we have as an industry and as a government, 2050 for setting our ambitions to getting to net zero is just too far down the line. We're just kicking it further and further down the line for next generations to fix the climate mess that we've created. And so when we think about how can we actually deal with this, for us, the elephant in the room is supply chain. As designers, as consultants, we can get to net zero operations, we can get to carbon neutrality. But 95% of those carbon emissions in the construction industry are through supply chain. And how are we ever going to get to net zero without getting the supply chain to embrace that scope 3 emissions reduction? So for us, that's a huge part of the net zero story.
Brilliant, Chris, and I agree absolutely. And there's actually bits of that I want to touch on. And I think housing is one of the really big things. I was in a meeting this morning with an MP, a Labour MP, because the other ones aren't around very much at the moment. And we were talking about the big things that were hitting the future. And we were saying, what are the main ways that we, the built environment, could support politicians? And she was saying the two critical things are housing affordability, which actually is about volume of housing, and cost of living crisis are the two huge big issues that she is seeing in her postback at the moment. So there's a short term, there's a long term, there's a big current societal issue. It is all about what we do. I also might broaden your point, Chris, later on to talk about the infrastructure around housing. Like, it's all very well building a very well insulated box in a particular place, but actually we need to make sure that the people in those well insulated boxes can live in a very low carbon way. And too often we actually shove them at the end of towns where people have to actually be very car dependent and things like that. So I think that's what we do in our built environment, is also actually how we enable people to live better low carbon lives, and how we make that appealing. Aidan, you please introduce yourself and give your provocation. I'm really interested to find, again, the overlaps between where we're all coming from.
Hi, yeah, thanks for that. My name's Aidan. I'm a co-founder of a company called EnviroBuild, which is a company which is essentially looking to lower the embedded carbon of certain initially niche building products, but just building products in general. Historically, I have been a serial entrepreneur. The first company I set up was a specialist subcontractor in the installation of solar PV panels back in about 2009. And prior to that, I had worked in academia. So I've got a PhD in nanomagnetics. In terms of which I do not use at all in any way anymore. In terms of my provocation or prevarication, which might be provoking, but it's not meant. Like, as a company, we sit sort of on the supply chain end of, I guess, the building supply industry, and we've been lucky enough to sell product into probably up to about 90% of the top residential builders in the UK as the main contractors. Now, for a couple of years now, we've had sort of life cycle analyses and EPDs available for our customers. And I can say, as an entire company, only once in that entire time have we been asked in advance of winning a contract for that data, which obviously says to me that they actually don't care. So for any of the marketing that exists around what people might be saying, if they were using it as a basis to make choices, they by definition must have asked for it in advance. So as a company, we have to rely on sales and the standard routes, on sort of quality, on service, on price. And that is what we see to the prevailing culture within the construction industry, particularly cost. So my one is, how can we actually hope to achieve the more difficult cuts in carbon emissions, because the ones we're making at the moment are the easy ones. And as has previously been said, primarily within scope 3, how can we do it without legislation? And if so, how?
Thanks, Aidan. And I think there's an awful lot to get there. I think there's actually a very neat thread that runs through all three of your presentations so far. Just to introduce myself then, I thought I'd go last, even though I was the first one to speak. My name's Tim Chapman. I'm a director in Arab. I've been in Arab for only 3.5 decades, so I'm quite new in Arab terms. I was originally a geotechnical engineer, therefore dealing with risk. I then moved into dealing with big infrastructure and then decarbonization of big infrastructure. And more lately, I've actually pivoted my career working via the Construction Innovation Hub Value Toolkit to be about making sure we set up projects to succeed at the very beginning. And in my world, to go into my provocation, the thing that really irritates me, which touches actually on what some of you have said, is net zero as a term being used really badly. There's various aspects of how the term net zero is used badly. The two that probably get my goat the most. The first one is net zero is meaningful on a planetary level. We need to reduce the overall flux of greenhouse gases to zero instead of the roughly 50,000 million tons that sort of emanate from the Earth upwards and don't come back down again. And that's roughly translates into national boundaries. We have sort of territorial emissions and consumption-based emissions. And the UK is beginning to go in slightly different directions in both of those. We're reducing our territorial emissions well, but not our consumption-based emissions. We're importing more stuff than we should do. And this goes back down to building materials as well. But especially, a bit that really irks me then is the fact that we then try and make every project net zero. And the fundamental flaw in that is if I tell you to reduce your expenditure from X £1,000 a year to half of that, you don't reduce your expenditure on champagne and tin sardines equally. You probably actually buy more tin sardines and less champagne if you're rational in how you do this. And my worry is that sort of on net zero, trying to make everybody reduce by the same proportion, we're actually missing an awful lot of tricks. It's absolutely right that if you build a new bank, it should be net zero. Your imposition on the rest of society is such that it should be. And actually offsets, and again, we may touch on offsetting later on, is the way to do that. But if you're actually building a hospital or if you're building a new transport system or even a new nuclear power station, it's bonkers to expect Hinkley Point C to be net zero in itself. It facilitates switching off all the coal and gas-fired power stations, and therefore it's a really good thing, but it won't be net zero within its own red line. And therefore, how do we create the infrastructure systems? How do we invest to save? How do we do the things that we should be doing rationally with our carbon to make sure we produce a low carbon future? And don't, because actually the sum of making everything net zero is a very, very slow reduction. And we need big systems changed to do this. So I think it fits in actually with the conversation we've had so far. But again, it's a general appeal to all of our listeners. Please do put questions in the chat bar. We really look forward to seeing them. And I'm going to mine those later on for future topics for us to be discussing. Chris, there's quite an overlap actually between yours and Aidan's talk, and you're basically talking about the same problem from slightly different perspectives. I'm just wondering, do you want to actually come back on that and maybe even reflect back on all four of our provocations? And do you have anything that's sort of how they come together in your mind?
Yes, I mean, ultimately, the idea of the scope 3 and supply chain, and I like Aidan's question, how do we do it without regulation? I don't think we can. I think we're starting to see Part Z start to push us towards having some kind of modeling that's required. I had this discussion at a previous panel with Brittany from her partner presented earlier today about who's ultimately responsible for making these decisions. Is it the end user? Is it the developer? Is it the economic buyer? Is it the designer? It's kind of all of us, but regulation probably has to drive it because we're not good at making the good decisions. We kind of drive towards these economic gains rather than the things that matter if we're looking at net zero. And so, I mean, my simple answer is I think it needs to be regulatory driven. We're not seeing a huge driver from the supply chain. We had a session with a potential supply chain partner that we won't name, obviously, and they were really chuffed that over the last 5 years they had a 2% decrease in their carbon emissions, and we went 2%. Whoa, you got to get to zero, right? Like, and for them that was monumental. So there's a lot of education that needs to happen. There's a lot of aid that needs to happen to get companies on board. And you know, 2030, that's where we're hanging our hat. But we're going to fail unless our supply chain gets there. And so we're working both upstream and downstream with the developers, with local councils, but also with their supply chains to try to get them there. And Tim, to your point, it's difficult to try to do this on a singular level. It's like, again, this is another conversation that we've had a lot over the course of the last years, but it's too difficult to look at each thing as an individual entity, as an island that has to have everything unto its own. And as you zoom out, there's more opportunity there. And so if you zoom out at a master plan level or town planning level or a city level, like you have more opportunity for the net zero projects or energy production projects to help balance off the others that add whether social values you might have for the project. So I think all four of the provocation, I slip that word all the time, they're all very, they all touch each other, don't they?
They do, Chris. I'm going to actually come to Aidan and Helen, and whichever one of you indicate first, I'll come and pick on you. But actually, to some extent, I think we had Paul Morell earlier on in a slightly husky but very well colourful presentation talking about the introduction of BIM. And BIM was interesting because that wasn't actually it wasn't mandated as in regulation, but government as a client said that we want this to be done on all of our projects, and therefore the industry had to become BIM ready. And I think that's both, there's some interesting good and interesting bad lessons in that. I think the good lesson is that they did make the better part of the industry that wants to work for government wake up and realize they had to suddenly equip themselves. The bad side is I think the rest of the industry didn't bother. And also most clients didn't actually really want it in the end either, so didn't know what to ask for and couldn't tell their projects to be BIM ready. The other interesting one, I think, is actually the Heathrow February 2020 third runway being overturned in the courts. And from my infrastructure world, that had a huge effect. A lot of clients, I think, probably paid lip service, big infrastructure clients paid lip service. They said the carbon was important, but actually when push came to shove, money was an awful lot more. After that, I think carbon became a currency that was almost equivalent to money, and the logic of it became very strong. I was going to touch on two standards actually, as we're here from BSI. Past 2080, I was involved with both conceiving and writing, and I think it's been a monumental improvement in what we do in the infrastructure industry, because it actually sets up this concept of invest to save, and it sort of gets away from the scope 3 sort of bit of being loosely defined, and in a way people trying to dump ownership of their own bit of it, because it looks at the asset base only in terms of capital carbon, mental block, the carbon in running it, and then the carbon by users. And I think the whole concept of using, sorry, OPEX was the term I'm looking for, and OPCARB is the phrase. So you've got capital carbon, OPCARB, and use carb, and you can actually invest to save on those three. We also have Flex 390, BSI Flex 390, which again I've been involved with, which is the standard that's just been produced that mimics the Construction Innovation Hub Value Toolkit about trying to buy for broader value. But I won't go into that now, but I just want to actually flag those two standards as BSI are our hosts today. Helen or Aidan, do you want to come in and probably respond to what Chris has said or add anything else to our discussion?
Yeah, I'll go. So in relation to regulation, I was at a talk yesterday about neighbours. That's all to do with operational energy in, well, specifically office buildings, but it can also apply to other buildings in Australia. There's now the UK version that's been launched in the last year. And there was a conversation there about should neighbours or something similar become regulation, and so that we are regulated, unregulated energy users. And I think the thought in the room was it would be better to have no regulation than to have a bad or very undefined regulation. So I think the idea of, like, if you're going to regulate it, you need to do it properly is quite interesting. But also, there's nothing to say that the industry can't be pushing that forward, and almost leading the government and saying this is what you need to do, which has come out of Part Z. But there's a lot more that we could be doing as an industry, both from the design side, construction, supply chain. And the more that we show that it's doable and that we want to do it, the more the government are going to help in that regulatory process. But the other thing I was going to say was that Neighbours in Australia came out of the government leasing office buildings, being one of the largest leasing people in Australian cities, and they said, well, we want a neighbours rating. So it wasn't regulated as in there's equivalent building regs, but it was just the office leasing market that really pushed that through. And now it's really, really commonplace in Australia. And hopefully that will happen in the UK as well. But the similar idea could be brought across into the embodied carbon market too.
Thanks, Helen. Aidan, your thoughts?
I mean, I guess starting with your thoughts in terms of should all the industry reduce at the same time? I mean, I guess it's obviously not. Like, you don't want to look at the embedded carbon necessarily of a solar PV panel at the same time as you're looking at a coal-fired power station, for the exact reasons that you specified. How that is divided up, I guess, sits within every territorial plan. Like when it gets to the UN and they're saying this is the amount we're going to give up, and agreeing entirely on your point that it's done probably on the wrong thing rather than on consumption. It's done on how much, like, I think that's definitely wrong, but I don't sit in the seat of power to have any particular influence on that. And I think the West has got, I mean, it's obviously in the West's favor to not count it that way. So the biggest polluters aren't going to necessarily put their hand up immediately. And we've seen that when it's even just looking at the amount of money they say they're going to give and then they don't give. So staying out of the international politics side of it, yes, within the UK space, it would obviously be sensible within our plan to have it broken down by sector, and then within the sector by most noticeable part. But here is where my ignorance is like, I'm not actually sure if that's what we're currently doing. Like, and that's a genuine thing. Like, I assume we've looked at it on a sector basis and said farming has to do this, construction has to do that. I don't know at a level above where I sort of tend to read around if we are looking at the impacts of Heathrow compared to whether we actually even still need it with the reducing like travel, and if anyone's got the guts to say actually we don't need this anymore after having given permission, and just suck it up. In terms of reusability of building materials and how that is identified, it would be great. Like, I've been involved in, one of the things we've been involved in a lot as a company is the selling of materials onto balconies. So we sold a lot of materials onto balconies, which obviously after the disaster tragedy at Grenfell, all had to literally be ripped up and remade. Like that, so that everything that we had sold, we could sometimes sell back onto the same job, but you knew it was just getting skipped. So you knew it was stuff that had 60 years worth of life on it. Realistically, and nothing, it'd been used for a year, but you knew the economics of it didn't work for anyone to really recollect and have sort of essentially secondhand, cut to different lengths. How can you find a job for this? No one's going to accept it as new. You see a few industries where they're trying to make it work, sort of like in some stuff in vinyl it worked. I know in gypsum they worked very, very hard with government legislation to force it to be recycled in certain ways. But the economics of small amounts being reused, I mean, where do you store it? Do you have these huge warehouses that wait for the next job to come along 3, 5, 7 years away? Like, I would love there to be a truly circular economy. The answers are really, really complicated, and without huge storage of materials, it needs to be talked at an industry level, because there needs to be an industry understanding that if something is to be reused and is to have a value, then it actually helps everyone. It's the only way society and an industry can get there. But it is the top 50 main contractors sitting down together through the various associations they have and getting it done, because nobody else really, like, they have a reasonable length of power and they're reasonably concentrated. There's not actually that many of them. If you want to get to 80% of the construction industry, you could probably do it in 40 or 50 of them for big builds. So yeah, Helen, I'd love that to be true. But again, don't know how. And in terms of how Dan and I have talked about the same things from scope 3, it's like, yeah, 95% of the construction industry is scope 3. I had the flyers around not the emails around from Travis Perkins being like, you've really got to get your scope 1 and scope 2 sorted within the next year and a half. And you're like, okay, we've got 5 years to make all these changes. And within a year and a half, we have to have accounted, not even changed, but accounted for the first 5% of our emissions. And you're like, okay, we're nowhere. Like, we are so far from being anywhere as for it to actually be farcical. And if you were to go through the supply chain and see how many have accurately mapped out their scope 3 and done their LCAs and done their EPDs, let alone have it done by somebody who understands what they're actually doing as opposed to putting it out, and let alone having the information used by the genuine CXOs to look at that information and recognize it's something they should be doing and adds value. Like, you can tell that I'm in a quite negative mood at the moment. I'm not quite sure why. I think I was more positive yesterday. But obviously, scope 3 accounting needs to be done more seriously. The timelines are not fast enough, and it needs to have teeth. Like, without legislation putting a value on everything we're trying to do, there will always be a company outside it not doing it. And there are a few main contractors who are going, like, really trying. You can and clients, there are a few clients and main contractors who are really trying, but because the majority simply are not, it gets dragged down to that level for the majority of jobs.
I would say, on a more positive note, there are some clients that are really, really trying. So you've got clients that might own and manage like millions of meters squared of offices, and they know that there's a turnover of things like floor tiles and raised flooring. And because they are owning that estate and they also operate it, they're able to store things like the raised floor at the end of the tenancy. When the next one comes along, they're able to reuse it. So I think there are examples of where that circular economy is coming. I totally appreciate that that is such a small proportion, but they're the people that we can learn from.
I'm going to ask two linked questions. So I'm going to ask two linked questions and just go around all of you with them. I mean, to some extent, the last 50 to 100 years has been an aberration in humankind, where we actually, everything had to become new. Before sort of 1950s, we were very happy to repair things, both actually in terms of building fabric and even in terms of all the things that we buy ourselves. After that, we got into sort of consumerism and we stopped. It became really bad to buy, to mend things. Clothes being a really good example, where now it's fast fashion. We buy new clothes, something gets a small rip, something what needs a patch, we never patch it. No one knows how to sew. It's cheaper just to go and buy something new. Same in buildings. There is this sort of thing of we rip out every item and replace it rather than repair it because it's too difficult. Before, we didn't, because actually the economics meant that new things were too expensive, and especially even with resource scarcity after World War II, there was very much a make, do, and mend. Likewise, actually, in how we use our cities. Cities have been around for 2,000 years plus. We coexisted with very nice, cute buildings that we now view as classical and beautiful, and we list them. But then, in the sort of early part of the 20th century onwards, we then started ripping all these down and putting in car parks and putting in large lumps of sterile, anonymous concrete blocks, all of which were built for a single use, got demolished after 30 years, went back in, put another big building on the site, got away from the whole thing of designing to last. I mean, we now design them in code for a 50-year life rather than a 100-year life. You look at the Victorian hospitals that still actually have some good in them 150 years later. I'm just wondering, the economics now shifted too far towards the new and shiny, and reusing old is actually much more expensive. It needs higher skilled people. It needs much more both to do the design and to do the sort of the craft work that's required to make them live longer. But actually, potentially, we're doing something a favor to society by trying to do it. And I'm just wondering, how could we change the economics to make circular economy far more positive? And then, given the fact this conference is meant to have a digital theme to it, I'm just wondering about digital passporting and things like that. That might be a way of actually trying to facilitate this. Chris, I interrupted, so I'm going to let you go first. It's probably the difficult one. Then I'll go around Aidan and Helen. So your reflections on those provocations.
Yeah, well, the idea that a lot of us are building into the new designs and what we're creating, digital twins and material passports, so we can treat buildings as material banks. But to your point, if we build a new building now and it sees out its lifespan, that's 50, 60, 100 years before those come back in, right? And we have a problem now, and it's the carbon we're spending now that's the issue. We're going to fall off the cliff very soon. So all the things that we're doing now is helping for the future. So we're laying that groundwork. Really, what something that we've been talking a lot about is trying to figure out some sort of platform for those reused materials and certification process. Our biggest problem right now is for our physical product, we're a hot rolled steel frame solution. We're multifamily, multi-story. With, you know, post Grenfell, we can't go with mass timber. It's just not a code compliant construction methodology. And so then how do we look at steel, which is, you know, a virgin steel, as it's a high carbon content material, so we can start looking at some of the hydrogen fueled steels that are coming out, but that's still, you know, mined ore. And then there was actually a really great talk. I was down at the Footprint Footprint Conference down in Brighton a few weeks ago, and the folks from Elliott Wood did a great presentation on some of the work they're doing with Great Portland Estate, and having a donor building and utilizing the materials within that for a new building, right? And that's beautiful if you're working on an estate level, where, you know, within your portfolio you have almost your own database. But actually it's looking one level up and having a database of maybe donor buildings that are coming online to marketplace rather than materials, because I don't think we're nuanced yet enough as an industry to go, okay, we have this much steel that's been certified that's now open into the market. It's probably 1 or 2 levels up at a level of developer or estate owner that knows that buildings are coming to end of life, having a monetary value affixed to the materials within that, and then having a platform that allows people to buy on an open marketplace. So we're not having to go back and buy virgin materials that come with an economic and societal cost. So I'm a bit like Aiden today. I'm feeling the kind of weight of it, because it's such a massive, like, you pull at a string and it just, you know, it goes in every direction. And so the idea of circularity is amazing, but it's not something that we can prepare for 100 years from now. We actually have to figure out how we can inject circularity in the kind of dumb non-digital assets we have today. And that's, you know, maybe that is at estate level.
Thanks, Chris. Aidan, challenge for you is to reply like Chris did, but in a more uplifting way.
Positive reply. What you laid out in the original question, Tim, was exactly right. We've become too efficient at manufacturing things, and we've made it at a level where to repair things, you need to be so highly skilled that your day rate is much higher than the machine worker who's involved in the initial manufacture, and and their efficiency is so much lower. So the crux of the problem started with Adam Smith, right? Where do we? I mean, how do we go back on 450 years of specialization in 5 years or 10 years? I unfortunately do often fall back on the only way to economically price it in is through legislation, whether it be carrot or whether it be stick. But I think the cost of this is going to be the cost of it. It can be done. It just needs to be costed. It just needs to be that if you're using something secondhand, you get a tax break of some description, or you get something happens enabling it to happen, or it's a taxation on new materials being bought. So actually, for virgin materials, particularly virgin materials that you identify out early as more polluting, there is this carbon tax type proposition placed upon them. That's the only way I can think of doing it, which potentially shows the limit of my imagination. Because I would love for everyone to work together and for all the companies to come together and figure something out, but I don't know. I've wanted that for 20 years.
I'm probably the only person here who's old enough to remember milk bottles, but that worked fairly well, where you pay the deposit. Yeah, okay. But actually, to some extent, the simple solutions may be the ones that actually are there, where you pay a decent deposit. Helen, I'm going to come to you in a second. I just wanted to actually check with Dan, who's hopefully still online and doing things. Dan, I'm checking the chat bar. I think we've had no questions in yet from the audience. First of all, if I'm right on that, the audience are encouraged to ask some. But Dan, we just make sure it's not user error rather than audience error in this.
So Tim, I'm always listening, and I'm listening with great interest. And so I think what's happened is people have probably been stunned into silence and listening to the very interesting conversation. But you know, as you've invited me in, I will ask a question. it does go back near the start. So I think there was a really interesting point, I think, Helen, that you made around ensuring that buildings are adaptable. And an analogy that I've always enjoyed is the conversation of what I used to call, I stole this from 99% Invisible, which was whether buildings should be sheds or duck hatcheries. And by that, what I mean is, do you just design something as a blank box that you then customize within it to suit your purpose, or do you make a building fit for a specific purpose? And obviously the way that if you have a duck hatchery building, it can't be, you know, a telecoms office. So I guess in this situation here, and if I'm going to try and hold the side of architecture and architectural technology, I like the idea of buildings being fit for purpose. But where do you strike the balance between adaptable, being soulless, for want of a better phrase, and some of these the concepts we're talking about now? Because I totally get the idea that in let's say 20 years, what IT infrastructure we place into a building will be totally different. And actually, we've gone from cables to having hubs, to which could be something else. And actually, you know, are we going to put 5G antennas somewhere, or do, you know, there's all sorts of things that could change, where we'll have to pull out all of the coaxial cables we put in everything and all the Ethernets, because no one's going to use them anymore. So there needs to be a level of adaptability, but where on that spectrum is the right place, if you're also trying to bear in mind this idea of circular economy elements, and what do you do with 12 miles of Ethernet cable that no one's now going to be using? And then with that, I will pop off the screen to allow you to discuss that. But please, audience members, you know, Tim is asking for questions, and I'm sure yours are just as awkward as mine. So please throw them through. Thank you.
Yeah, Helen, keep on doing, but don't, rest assured, I got many more questions to keep us going for the 40 minutes. So, but it's good to get a few more coming in. So, Helen, over to you to answer Dan's difficult provocation back.
I think it's really hard. How can you decide what needs to be adapted in the future if you don't know what this future holds? So we take COVID as a really good example. Suddenly, overnight, every office block was empty. And then now people are going back to the office. Some of that office space needs to be used again, but not all of it. And actually, how adaptable are office buildings to be changed to other uses, residential, retail, sport and leisure, whatever it might be. But I think there are some adaptations that we know we're going to need. So if you just look at the changing climate, we know that the UK is going to get hotter. So being able to adapt your facade really easily will only be a good thing. So whether that is to allow additional soluble shading to be put on, to change window panels and replace with wall panels, to allow rooms to be moved around to suit orientation. So where we might have south-facing meeting room, for example, at the moment, as the climate changes, our cooling loads are going to go through the roof. So how easy is it to change that onto an east facade and remove a solid wall panel, put a window in so that we get some daylight? And it's those kind of things that we can think actually in the future, if we have an adapting climate and an adapting usage, how easy would it be to marry those two things together? I think there's other examples where we know that MEP services last for 20, 25 years compared to a building that's going to be lasting for 50 plus years. So when we're installing, making sure that we allow for easy replacement of services, and that's not necessarily like for like services. We've seen a massive shift from gas boilers to electric heat pumps over the last few years. And what's to say that in 20 years' time, the heat pumps that we're putting in now are going to be replaced like for like? So how easy is it to enable space planning so that all those services can be replaced but adapted at the same time? So I think there's an element of what we can do easily through simple design choices, things like componentized facades, additional space on the roof or ground floor level for plant, allowing holes through beams for additional services in the future. You know, there's a lot of stuff like that. But then there's that element of you don't want to over design because that just uses more materials. So if you're designing your loadings for a certain use, do you then allow for additional loadings just in case a room is going to be used as an lecture theatre instead of an office? And that's really hard because it might never be used. So is it worth it? And the answer is probably no. But how do you make that decision? Where do you draw the line? And I don't think there's any really clear decision-making process, but you've just got to be sensible and look at what the additional materials are versus the potential benefit. It might be that allowing a more digital design where you know a bit more about the building, you know how the structure works. If you wanted to make some of those choices and upgrade the structure at a later date, if you have more information about what is currently there, you might be able to do those enhancements more simplistically in the future.
I'm working with some of your colleagues on the new hospital programme, and Paul Morell this morning spoke about the fact that serial clients have got almost an obligation to change the industry more than anybody else, because the whole of the industry has been characterised by too much one-off clienting. You buy a hospital, you then employ a different design team to build a different hospital, and we actually don't progress. But if we could sort of change the how we do hospitals to how we do iPhones, and we have sort of a generation 1, generation 2, generation 3, and the first generation is done as well as we can do. We spend a lot of time working out. To give you an example of one we're talking about this week, was actually almost the front doors to a hospital. Are they pivoted? Are they whether they're sort of circular one or whatever else? Actually, should be one answer for that in the UK, whether you're in Bournemouth or Blackburn or Blackpool or wherever else, because you're trying to marry a series of constraints. You don't want all the hot air to go out or cold air to go out of the hospital when you open the door. Equally, you want it to be very easy for people who are less able to get in and out and make sure it's very accessible. And those two things are in direct conflict. But at the moment, we have sort of 48 hospital teams designing that particular answer 48 times and come up with 48 different answers. And therefore, we never standardize, we never improve. But especially, we can't improve sequentially, because if we at least put the same one into all of the hospitals, we would discover there's a better answer, and we could progressively improve it. And actually bringing digital sensors in, we could actually have lots of sensors in the hospital to work out which bits are more used, which bits aren't used. And then pick up Helen's point, were we to make one area much more heavily laden or capable of taking much heavier loads, as an example, we don't know what treatments are going to happen in 20 years time or 50 years time or 100 years time. We don't know what the patient flows are going to be. But at least we put lots of sensors in, we can actually then progressively learn and work out that corridor was far too wide, that corridor was far too narrow, the lighting in this area is too bright. It was actually cost effective to put in circadian lighting to actually improve everybody's moods and help both staff be more efficient and patients to recover better. And giving us that sort of database area to actually improve things. And you might conceive of one thing we're playing with at the moment is do we move towards the 100-year hospital, which is ultimately flexible, because actually hospital treatments will change over a 50-year life. So why not build a hospital that's actually capable of having a 100-year life? And when you do that, pick up Helen's point, the M&E needs to be replaced maybe twice in that period. So maybe you put in enough redundancy in the M&E to make sure that the hospital can survive while you're replacing the M&E kit. You don't have to actually close the hospital down when you're doing these things. So these sort of thinkings, I think, are really interesting. I'm just going to actually go around each of you and then get with that as a sort of fresh provocation into the mix. Aidan, coming to you first, what are your thoughts about how that might change the environment for your products and your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, standardizing buildings feels like something that was rolled out quite widely across the Eastern Bloc of Europe through the communist era. And I presume that they learned quite a lot as they built their massive concrete shacks, and they look different. I think on one-off buildings, I think, like if you've got 48 different hospitals around the country, I don't think anyone would mind that. I think if you start to get to residential blocks in central London, people distinctly mind that. So I think where you have described on a hospital, or probably like a secondary school or primary schools, actually that's incredibly sensible, particularly when this is funded from the private purse. So there's not even competing interest to try and sell it. So yes, I mean, take that down to a very good idea that sounds like it should work, and then just adapt to the slight difference in locations, be that the footprint or whatever. And as you say, the learning on the type of door, the learning on the type of window, everything around that sounds very, very sensible. I think as you get more private sector and you've got landlords competing for office space or landlords competing to sell their flats, then I think that learning actually becomes part of almost the IP of a company. Insofar as if they have a mechanism that makes their building more habitable, look nicer, more efficient, they're probably not that willing to share it. So open knowledge transfer programs, I mean, it happens anyway because people move between the companies and they go, we did this here, we did that there. So actually over time, it always comes to everyone. So maybe as an industry to just say this is the environmental best practice, and have that as an open forum chaired by whichever august society, be it REBA, be it one of the engineering ones, whichever one thinks is the most august, and they can sit there and have it and run it. And that sounds super sensible, to be honest, Tim. Like, it sounds good ideas from you and Helen.
Just checking, actually, Chris, moving on to you. Aidan raised an interesting point. It's almost as a thing of innovation and innovators getting a payback for what they're doing versus IP and keeping things, making sure that sort of we keep things, the whole industry can benefit. Do you think there's a sweet spot on that, or something we can learn from somewhere else in that field?
I mean, I think as an industry, we're all too protective about information that isn't. They're not exactly trade secrets, are they? How to design a flat, right? a one-bed flat or a two-bed flat, most developers now are going to national space standards. So if the design is slightly this way or that, I don't think there's that much in it. And I mean, to Aidan's point around big communist blocks, like that's I think standardization's got a bit of a kind of like prefab as well, right? It's a bit of a dirty word, and for me, standardization is absolutely the way. Like around sustainability, around efficiencies, around driving towards truly affordable housing, around reuse. If we have standardization utilizing material sizes and we start to look at waste reductions, there's a whole lot in standardization, and it doesn't necessarily mean you pick from a building and say, right, I'll have 3 of those buildings and 1 of those. The standardization could be at apartment level or block. I'm starting to use modulus language to, compartmental level, and you could still dress buildings in from a standard palette of facade treatments, and so every building could still look unique. It's just built from standard components that are well thought through, that the efficiencies are built in, and it's digitized, so at end of life we could demount and reuse those things. Now I'm just thinking back to one of the things you said earlier, Tim, and it flows into the standardization. It was around how do we move from buying new to make, do, and mend. And I think one of the things that we saw a few years ago, Philips had introduced this idea of light as a service as opposed to selling fixtures. And I think the more creative we get with things, so if you can imagine Mitsubishi or one of the HVAC providers moves to cooling as a service, right? So then they're incentivized to, one, provide cooling nonstop or heating nonstop, but also they own that equipment, right? And it changes the economic drivers in reliability and the ability to fix and repair things. And that same methodology can be translated across lots of things. We were talking with a supply chain partner who has a material, and when you put it together with a couple other things, it's a new product. And they went, oh, we could actually do that whole thing and then provide that as a service. And in the city, every 3 years, commercial tenants, they just tear down and then they rebuild because they do, right? They want to refresh stuff, but rather than tear down everything, we can take that, rehab it, and then put it back into circulation. And so we're already starting to see this idea as things as a service, as opposed to just selling it as, buying that product. So, I think standardization at a material level all the way up to kind of block level, building block level, is the way forward, and then digitizing that whole process and then moving from a purchase to a service in certain sectors is for my money, like, that's starting to get us towards a better place.
Thanks, Chris. I'm going to come to you, Helen, next, because Bryden would have done a huge amount on these sort of ideas and with a range of areas. Your role in particular is about actually the decarbonisation one. So I'm sure you've been wrestling with lots of the knotty issues that lie behind some of these implications. And what are your best insights from a decarbonisation point of view of how well these work, but also where the big roadblocks are?
Yeah, so we've done loads of standardisation work, residential, office, hospitals, all sorts of different buildings. And you start off having a really, really standardised solution. And then by the time you get to trying to put that across the whole building, you end up with so many bits that are non-standard. And often it's the client that is driving it. So I'm not going to blame the client at all. But the client has a view of how it should look. And that results in non-standardization on maybe a corner or just one end of the building. Then you've got to add on sort of the planning. So you can't build on that part of the site because you're going to overlook there, or you've got rights of light issues or that kind of thing. So that then means that your nice square building becomes a bit of a weird shape. So you've got a non-standard component there. So I think you need everyone to agree that you're going to have a standard approach or standardized approach. Everyone needs to buy into it at the earliest stage, and then you can follow it through a lot more clearly, sensibly, and get a better response at the end. I know Chris mentioned about sort of demountable things and people ripping parts of the building out every few years, particularly in the city. And I think one of the answers to that is to design in deconstruction from the start. So if you're able to have bolted connections rather than welded, not only do you take the hot trade off site, but you allow lower skilled labour, which opens up a larger pool of labour as well. But it also means at the end of that part of the building's life, whether it be an M&E component or a whole steel frame, it can be demounted, deconstructed more easily. You've obviously then got your digital component that tells you exactly what that is. It can be reused. You're then back to that circular economy aspect of where do you store it, where do you use it. But you are able, for your standardized approach, to build all of that stuff in earlier. I think, yeah, there's a lot of learning, but for me, it's you need to incorporate this right at the early stages of design. If you try and do it later, say you've got to stage 4, you've got a detailed design, and then you want to apply a manufacturer's system, it makes it really, really difficult. The earlier you can do it, the easier it becomes.
I agree totally, and I had the good fortune and misfortune to be the client for our new headquarters in London, and working with 3,000 other designers, all of whom had strong opinions about what it should be. Was an interesting experience, but actually we got everyone together, and I was very determined to make sure that we didn't have change during execution, because I think clients tinkering with things on the way through is one of the biggest enemies of actually what can go wrong. And therefore client discipline of saying this is what I want very early, and being clear that it is really, really what they want, and facing the client through all the various parts of making sure they have brought all their key stakeholders with them, I think is a large part of this. I think our industry has been too accommodating. Again, Paul Morell was talking this morning about the fact that if we were the automotive industry, or basically compared to automotive, and every one of our buildings basically would go back to the garage within 3 months for a major overhaul. If we were making cars, whereas while we do blame cars, they have become hugely more productive and better from standardization. And the same sort of thing happens in other industries. I mean, it used to be defense was even worse than construction for cost overruns and program overruns. They're slowly getting their house in order. And I think one of the things that I'm very impressed with the new hospital program is the leadership of that is trying to work out how we stop massively overspending on hospitals, how we move away from a world where every hospital is delivered sort of twice the budget, sort of several years late, and can actually turn them into products where not only do we get rid of the wildly bad overspends and program overruns, but we actually make sure that they work first time, work out of the tin, and have a very disciplined set of designers bringing in disciplined sets of changes that are only to us making it better. And again, Helen, your colleagues are working out in each of the cohorts how much MMC we can actually bring in. But I mean, hopefully bringing in optimum amounts. And one of the controversies at the moment is actually how we get the next cohort to be more disciplined because they're all ready to go, designed as 8 different hospitals with 8 different things. But we need to, as an example, bring in ground source heat pumps, make sure there's no fossil fuel combustion on any of those sites whatsoever, because once you do that, you're actually tied into 350 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour forever, and not tied into the grid getting better and better, and heat pumps giving you 200 or 300% efficiency as well. Aidan, in your multiple careers before, I was hoping you were going to say you were actually going to do heat pumps, because solar panels in 2008 is almost the heat pumps of now. And how do we stimulate the industries that we require to happen in a way in advance of government making it mandatory? So we have various indicators from the CCC that heat pumps will be part of the future. Sorry, a huge part of the future, and to some extent, I think might offset some of, sorry, I won't use the word offset, displace some of the hopes that hydrogen going into the grid will mean we have enough green hydrogen to replace all the methane, which I think is going to probably not happen in my lifetime. And I do hope to live to be old. That's not a health prediction. How do we set up a whole new industry like heat pumps? I would love to know a good heat pump installer in my area to actually replace my boiler. And I'm sure there's hundreds of thousands of people in the same place. But again, this is a nascent industry that it's going to be massively short of parts, suppliers, technology, know how to do it efficiently. Any insights from the solar panel revolution of 15 years ago?
Yeah, well, I mean, firstly, I mean, actually, slight apologies to Chris in terms of I didn't mean standardization would make everything look like the old Eastern Bloc. That wasn't what I meant. So apologies. I am very much in favour of standardization. But on that point, yeah, solar PV. When I joined the industry, it was before Ed Miliband had brought in the feed-in tariffs. So we were selling systems for £14,000 to individual homeowners and promising them returns of around 2 or 2.5% on their investment. So it was certainly to the converted rather than those looking at it. I mean, the way the PV industry caught off globally was essentially driven by Germany introducing a feed-in tariff. So they essentially said to individual people through central tax support, not central, through central payments, that if you do this, you will make a guaranteed return. It was literally all carrot. There was no stick in the early solar, and then lots of other countries looked at it, including the UK, and realized this is actually something that we could do to stimulate it. And as you say, like our grid has gone from, when I first started out, I think it was 0.568 kilograms of CO2 per kilowatt hour, and now I don't know the number now, but it's probably down at about 0.26 or 0.27 or something. So it's
about 0.18, I think, on average, or 180 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour most of the time.
So it's fallen 70% since I was doing it at the start, which is actually in and of itself incredible, and one of the biggest wins that society has had in the last sort of 15 years. So, but actually, once the incentive was there, the industry trained itself up incredibly fast. I remember looking at Ernst & Young reports and McKinsey reports of how fast the global solar industry would grow, and every single one was wrong because it went much, much faster. Because the moment there is a profit motive there for people, they'll get it done. And we were training up electricians, we were training up roofers at really high speed, and you would find a huge drive for training up the necessary plumbers, the necessary heating engineers. If you're looking at ground source, for the necessary people to create the deep, I've forgotten, I want to say bores. Yeah, the boring specialists. The boring specialists to get the down fast enough. It would come really, really fast. There would be an element of initial cowboy, unfortunately, where everyone's trying to train up too fast, and there's a few people slipping through the QA, like there would be. But most of the time, if these things are done badly, it's not truly catastrophic, and having a few things going wrong isn't the odd house flooding isn't the end of the world if you're getting 800 other ones done correctly and reducing the impact. Like it is one of those things that happens with a nascent industry. So if there is any form of incentive, then an industry will train itself up very, very fast. That's my genuine view, especially at the moment. Sorry.
So I was just going to say, just on the incentive, the new building regs are going to be a soft incentive to move away from gas boilers. So naturally, it will be a move towards heat pumps, but it's not a direct incentive to install a heat pump.
I think it's also where solar came through, is it was all retrofit. So what interests me more on heat pumps is how we go about retrofitting all the existing houses we have, because even if we built everything brand new net zero from now, we'd still miss our targets, right? Like, we have to figure out the harder thing of going back to Victorian stock housing or 1930s housing or 1960s housing and making it firstly airtight. Like, that's your first thing. And then once you've made it as airtight as you can without damp, but there's solutions available for that. Once you've done that, then how do we heat it more effectively? Like, that's the crux of it. And at some point, someone will look at their spreadsheet and realize they have to do it. And at some point, an incentive will come, and at some point, the industry will go up around it, and it will do it really, really fast, and it will do faster than the predictions have said it will.
Yeah. Chris, I'm going to ask you the same question now and get your thoughts on it, because I'm really interested in your also product side of things. Then for our last 10 minutes, I've actually just had a message. Apparently, Boris is auditioning for a new construction minister. And I'm going to ask each of you three to give me your pitch in 2 or 3 minutes for construction minister to make it the biggest bang for our buck over the next 5 or 10 years, to make sure that we really turn the dial. So you've got a free hand on legislation. There's a majority of 80 waiting to vote for all the measures that you actually want to bring in. And you're going to have a free hand to tell us how to change the industry. But before we come on to that, Chris, I'll go around on my screen. So I'm going to ask Helen, Aidan, Chris that as our finale. Chris, but I'm interested in your thoughts on the productization of things like heat pumps and what we can do to accelerate those industries.
I mean, I broadly agree with Aidan. I think where there's opportunity there, people will move towards that economic opportunity. I mean, it's every time this happens, it's a bit of a mini gold rush, right? And you're going to get some cowboys who mess things up and make it a bad name for it. I think the difficulty, and we saw this with the feed-in tariff, is sometimes these programs are too successful. And when they're too successful, like, the government panics and then they close it down, which is what we saw with the feed-in tariff, right? The usage went like this when the predictions were like this, and then they went, oh crap, like, and they just had to backpedal because it just wasn't funded to the same level. With the new heat pump incentive, the 5,000 pounds per, you know, it's wonderful. I think we saw this glut, and now there's this blockade, especially around supply chain, but it doesn't fundamentally, from retrofit, it with good design, and Helen could talk through this with their work at Bryden Wood. Like, you don't start with the technology, you start with the building fabric, right? And we're not addressing insulation, double glazed windows, airtightness, all these things that are fundamental before you add the technology to the building. We could throw PV and heat pumps on buildings, but if they still leak like a sieve, it doesn't matter, right? Where they're still going to be using lots of energy that could go to other things. So I think when we look at the retrofit market, we've got to address the things that aren't super sexy, and like insulating houses isn't the sexiest thing in the world. It's not the greatest technology. It's like, you either insulate on the outside or you insulate on the inside, and like and if you do it on the outside, it's a planning issue, and if you do it on the inside, it's a loss of space issue. So, like, which are you gonna do? You got to do one of them. And then same with windows, and same with airtightness. So I think from a product standpoint, honestly, today, right now, it's probably a supply chain issue, and that just goes back to fix or mend. And we live in a globalized world where stuff doesn't get made here anymore. And so, when boats go sideways in the Suez Canal and wars break out and everything else, it shows how fragile our whole ecosystem is in terms of supply chain and product. If we can't physically get those heat pumps that are manufactured from 15 different countries to make the components to bring here, it's a tough thing. But when that gets solved, because it will, the market will create itself. I'm confident. I'm confident in what Aidan said there. But I just think we're solving the wrong problem. I think we got to look at insulation and fabric first. It's the same as we would look at as a new building. Like, let's use that same approach.
Yeah. So pitch time. Helen, you've got this is your pitch to be the new Minister of Construction, to actually convince Boris that you can get your the COP26 report with the 10 things in can actually be made real. So what are the 3 or 4 things you would do in your pitch to turn the dial and make the industry vastly better?
First of all, I would never be construction minister, ever. Politics is just not my thing. But I think there's been a lot of development in legal.
You. I mean, you are number 2,427th on the list, so.
Okay, all right then. So I think there's been a lot of work towards decarbonising new builds, getting towards net zero carbon. I don't necessarily agree that we're the 100% of the way there, but at least there's a roadmap and it's moving. So I think we've just had loads of conversation about retrofit. So for me, it's all about retrofit, passive design of the retrofit, so improving insulation, air tightness, the quality of occupant comfort, because as soon as we make something more airtight, we're going to run the risk of overheating. So getting that balance right. So retrofit is probably number 1. Supporting the circular economy and material passports. We've had loads of conversations today about that, and I think that's really super important. Doing both of those things for regulation probably is the way forward. But also there's big industry groups, things such as LETI, which has got people, experts from the construction industry, from all the way from architects, engineers, supply chains, construction, everything together. And they're working through a lot of these problems. They're putting out guides to help us as an industry. And actually, if the government could take some, or a bit of a more involvement in that, I think that would, groups such as that would help to do a lot of the sort of legwork, if you like, and collectively we can come to better decision making.
Brilliant. So do you have any particular policies you would do, particular levers you would do to make those really good things happen? I mean, what are the hard levers you would pull?
I mean, Part Z, which is the potential embodied carbon building regs that might come into play at some point. That's an obvious one. But extending that into circular economy would be a really good idea. And I think the other regulation would be something towards retrofit. What that would look like, I'm not entirely sure because it's such a big area, but encouraging the use of more decarbonised heat sources, a fabric first approach, all those kind of things would be really good. And also just retaining buildings instead of knocking them down and rebuilding.
Okay. Aidan, over to you. Here's your pitch.
Oh, I'll look forward to becoming the most left-wing Tory minister in history. I think that, like, everything Helen said is incredibly sensible. I think in terms of, I was trying to think of stuff you could do around legislation that isn't just immediately money costing, because it's quite, like, I would be going to the Chancellor of Exchequer, who I don't even know who that is anymore, but whoever that is all the time, and begging them for money for various programs, because so around retrofit, we've already got the stuff where landlords have to bring it up to a level D on their EPC in order to rent it to private tenants. I think another thing you could do that's similar to that to speed it along would be at point of sale, but it has to be a certain point, because a decent chunk of housing is never actually shipped onwards. So you could move that up to a D, or you could move it up to the sort of within a few points of maximum as well if it can't get to a D, because a lot of historical houses can't necessarily get there, or houses can't get there. So you could do something around that in order to force private money to solve it. You might need to tighten up the assessors around something like that as well, because I know back in the day when we were doing solar, like anecdotally, let's say anecdotally, you could definitely get EPCs favourably if you needed to. But so that might need to be tightened up. I think you would, in terms of, I would probably try and do something to ensure harmonisation with the EU in many ways, because we're with EU legislation and EU standards, because I think that as we've talked about here, standardization is actually super key to everything in the manufacturing for product manufacturers. And to have, you've got your three big standard blocks in the world of the US, the EU, and China. The last thing the UK wants to do is try and go its own way, because it will be late. It will be later to have the newer products coming to us. So I think, like, I know it's a bad thing at the moment, and I know we're getting Brexit done and everything, but actually standardization across that would probably be good for sustainability. Something that's I think would be interesting to look at how to legislate around or to create would be, at the moment we obviously have to design to certain, like you were designing to certain standards in terms of energy use. I think what would be interesting would be to force people, rather than design to a specific standard, is to have it measured as it was after 5 years of use, and have it then back analyzed, and to then have a penal, like some kind of penalty imposed if, because we all know about the gap analysis. We all know that it's not designed in so way it's used. So, okay, well, we need to be better than that. Let's know how it's used and design to how it is actually used, and then sort of like solve it that way, and then have a some kind of something coming back if it's not right. And I don't know exactly what that is. It might need to be redesigned. You might have to pay for your own upgrades. It might be financial, something like that. I think
I'm going to cut you there, but I agree with it. I mean, Paul Morell this morning spoke about the gap analysis on buildings, and it's huge. And technology must be better than that. Our industry must be better. And you also raised the point of the compulsory retrofit when you sell a house, which is in the 6 carbon budget, but has not got the popular sort of, it hasn't made the technical press yet. I think it could be another poll tax, because it just basically, I wonder how the great British public will deal with losing 20-30 grand to fix every house. However, I don't know of any other way of doing it. So I think it's a hugely interesting political point. And I hope we have politicians brave enough to follow that one through. Chris, over to you for our last 3 minutes for your pitch for a construction minister. Which are the levers you'd pull to make a very quick, good change on decarbonisation?
I mean, much like Helen, I have no interest in being a construction minister. I'm very happy not being in politics. Going last is good and bad. All the good ideas seem to have gone, but you have time to formulate new ones, and my brain's not firing that quickly today. The thing I keep coming back to is planning, and looking at an overhaul of planning regulations around requirements. We've got, I don't even know how many planning departments we now have in England, let alone the UK, but they're all slightly nuanced, and that just makes life incredibly more difficult. When we talked about standardization and productization, like starting there as well. So having councils and planning departments overhauled, so that maybe we can look at pre-approvals for a productized approach, where if buildings have our productized or standardized approach that meet certain metrics, then they go through quicker, and maybe that'll get us to, again, affordable housing quicker at a price we can afford at a carbon zero. Part Z, absolutely. I think that's a bare minimum. I think I'd pair that with a carbon tax, and you know, carrot and stick, or maybe stick and stick. Like at some point we have to get real about a carbon tax in this country, and actually, you know, start to enact something that looks and acts like a carbon tax in a real way. And again, around retrofits, there's something there. Helen and Aidan both talked around it. I don't know what the mechanism is, but there's a lot of good. Oh gosh, there's a standard out of the Netherlands for retrofits that a number of the councils are starting to utilize on their own stock, but starting to utilize programs like that are trying to drive towards passive house style on retrofits as a construction method, I think would backfill that performance that we're seeing from a carbon standpoint in all the existing housing stock. So I think those are the 3 big things: planning, Part Z with a carbon tax, and then enacting some sort of retrofit legislation.
Excellent. Thank you for your pitches. We'll get back to you later on today after the next round of resignations to let you know where you sit in the pecking order. Thank you hugely to Helen, Aidan and Chris for massively insightful thoughts all the way through. It's been a really fascinating conversation, and thank you for the really great ideas.